Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last episode, we talked about the rebellion and the simmering undercurrent that would lead to the American Revolutionary War. Today we're going to start that war, although it doesn't start out as a revolutionary war. It starts as a military insurrection against British control. It doesn't turn into a revolution for a while, but we'll certainly get there. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this episode, you should be able to, number 3, identify the key events that marked the move towards American independence, and 4, explain how American forces were able to prevail in the Revolutionary War. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 3. The Continental Congress was put together as a grouping of all of the colonies called more or less for the first time in a mark of unity. The Massachusetts Assembly had issued the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves were urged Americans to defy the new laws, the intolerable acts that were put out by the British Parliament. They also said we should withhold our taxes and use that money to go prepare for war. Massachusetts was the capital of New England, and New England was the loudest voice, always calling for revolution. To coordinate resistance against the intolerable acts, a Continental Congress was convened in Philadelphia in 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met to address a set of controversial and divisive issues. A Pennsylvanian known as Joseph Galloway proposed that America should have a President General who's been appointed by the King and a national legislative council selected by all of the various colonial assemblies. The Galloway plan almost passed, actually. It almost passed, but it failed by a single vote, and it was seen by really just a bare majority as being too conciliatory. Said, no, that's giving too much power to the king, it's giving too much power to England, and the laws they want to foist on us are just intolerable. Instead, this Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress doesn't have any legal standing. It's just all of the colonies found their most important people and said, hey, go try to work out a deal on this thing. So the term Congress doesn't mean like a legislative body, it's just a group of people to solve an issue is often known as a Congress. So this, though, there was a Continental Congress. All of the colonies of the continent were being called in there, except Quebec and Rhode Island. But anyway, they called this First Continental Congress to demand a repeal of the Coercive Acts, and also to repudiate the Declaratory Act, and also stipulating that British control, insofar as the British should have any control over these colonies, should be limited to trade, because that's really the British colonial model. It's about making money in trade, so that's where it should stop. They urged economic retaliation, beginning with, for instance, a non-importation agreement beginning in 1874. That the colonies said, well, we're just not going to take any British stuff. If they want to import stuff to the colonies, that they will find no markets. They will find nobody buying it. They'll find no one to unload the ships. It's a non-importation agreement. They knew that this would actually hurt the colonies too, because that makes everything more expensive and rarer, but their goal was to go put economic pressure back on the crown. The British declared this Continental Congress to be an illegal assembly, and they refused to go negotiate with them or send their own commissioners to go negotiate. They said, Americans, listen, you guys need to go pay for your own defense. You also need to pay for your own administration. You also need to acknowledge that Parliament has the authority to tax you to go do those things. And they imposed not a non-importation agreement, but a naval blockade on American trade, saying you're also not going to import other countries' stuff into our colonies, any trade with foreign nations. And then they ordered the military General Gage, to go suppress any dissent in Massachusetts that he saw simmering. Subpoint B, by 1775, this talk of liberty, which we introduced in our last episode, this talk of liberty had pervaded the colonies. It wasn't just in New England anymore, but everybody wanted this cry for individual freedom, this liberty, right? And Americans began basing their claims not just simply on, the historical claims of the rights of Englishmen, but on the more abstract language of natural rights and universal freedom, these pillars of the Enlightenment. In particular, we get John Locke's theory of natural rights. It was very influential at the time. John Locke claimed that people have rights that come to them naturally, just by being a person, by just having a person, that just nature gives you these rights. He wouldn't have called them God-given rights. Locke was kind of uninterested in what God was doing with any of this, but he says that it's just nature. It's just part of who you are as a person. And these rights come naturally to all people. Everybody has certain rights. And in 1774, Thomas Jefferson wrote a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And it was a set of grievances against George III, especially his response to the Boston Tea Party. And Jefferson claimed that Britain had really no authority over the colonies. The argument goes like this. If the Crown is violating people's natural rights, then the Crown is wrong and people have no obligation to listen to orders from the Crown. The Crown has lost its authority, it's lost its legitimacy, and the people are on their own to go establish their own authority. Subpoint C. When the Continental Congress met in 1774, New England by this point was already openly defying British authority, and in September of that year, General Gage, following orders, ordered his own British troops to go seize any Patriot armories and storehouses in Charleston and in Cambridge, saying that if the colonists are amassing weapons to go put up a fight, then these are British subjects. They need to go. We have to take their guns from them. And in response, 20,000 colonial militiamen mobilized to go safeguard those supply depots. The most famous regiment, and ones that you might have heard of, are called the Minutemen of Concord, because they could, in a minute's notice, go be ready to go defend their, defend the peace that they're called to. And on April 18th of 1775, General Gage sent 700 soldiers to go capture colonial leaders and their supplies there at Concord. Alerted by Paul Revere and others, local militias met the British at Lexington and Concord. As the British retreated and they were pushed out by the Minutemen, the militiamen ambushed them from neighboring towns, and both sides suffered pretty hard losses. But General Gage suffered such great losses that he was actually recalled to Great Britain as seeing like a failure at putting down the rebellion. He was replaced by General William Howe. The Battle of Bunker Hill would go on to be a British victory. Bunker Hill in Boston was a British victory, but by March of 1776, the colonists had even forced Howe out of Boston. It prompted a second constitutional Congress. This time they said our original negotiations didn't work, and a new Continental Congress was called, and they said, okay, fine, let's raise an army, let's put an actual resistance force together, and they appointed George Washington as its new commander. In subpoint D, though, we have to understand that the goal of this was not necessarily independence, or at least that independence wasn't the clear goal in 1775. Opinions on whether or not the country should go be independent, it varied in the colonies, and it varied from person to person. A lot of prominent Americans said that if you resist Great Britain, all you're going to do is destroy all British respect for the political institutions of the country, and what you're really going to end up with is not a free country, but a mob-ruled anarchy. Most elites in Massachusetts and Virginia, they supported independence, but there were diverse populations in New York and Pennsylvania. They had less consensus in those places there. Other social groups like tenant farmers and the regulators, they refused to support the resistance movement, arguing that a brand new ruling class of wealthy patriots intended to go advance their own special interests, and at least there are rights of Englishmen, and would there be rights under a new government? Quakers, for their part, they opposed any kind of violence on religious conviction. The Quakers are radical pacifists. Other colonists tried to stay neutral, just simply to guard their property and their livelihood, saying, hey, all I need is just to take care of my own bacon, man. This isn't about politics. Roughly 15 to 20% of white Americans, they stayed loyal to the Crown, maybe as much as a third. There's not any real statistical evidence on this. The majority of white Americans, they wanted to resist British rule, if not overthrow it. In some ways, the Revolution was almost a civil war among Americans. Lord Dunmore in Virginia ordered 2 military forces. Lord Dunmore of Virginia. So if he's Lord Dunmore, he's carrying a carrying an aristocratic title. We can probably assume that he's going to be a loyalist. Lord Dunmore of Virginia organized two military forces, one white and one black, and he offered freedom to any slaves in Virginia and to any indentured servants who would join the loyalist cause and put down the rebellion. Faced with black unrest and pressed by yeomen and tenant farmers demanding independence, patriot planters called for a break with Britain. They said, okay, now listen, we've got British aristocrats calling for war against us and to, overthrow us and fight us with our own slaves. By April of 1776, radical patriots had, by military conflict, ended up turning the North Carolina Assembly, which was an assembly of the colony under the crown, but it turned it into an independent Congress. And they instructed its own representatives to go support independence. By May, Virginia had followed suit, and the consensus was building for a movement towards independence. That brings us to subpoint F. And on July 2nd of 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration declared that Great Britain's aim was to establish an absolute tyranny over the colonies, and as such, Congress declared that the United States should then be an independent country. Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration. He actually kind of repurposed larger pieces from his summary view on the rights of British America. He repurposed parts of that for the Declaration of Independence. He cribbed long sections of John Locke into the Declaration of Independence. But whatever it was, it's an American masterpiece. It's one of the favorite documents to any American today. The Declaration of Independence justified the revolt. They blamed the rupture on George III rather than on Parliament. This is an interesting rhetorical twist because I think most historians say that Parliament was actually the driving force here, not George III. But Jefferson understands his Enlightenment philosophy and understands that the king is the one that cares over all the people, and that it makes a more important rhetorical point to attack George III in particular. The preamble of the Declaration proclaims that all men are created equal, and that they possess the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the government derives its power from the consent of the governed. By linking together these doctrines of individual liberty, of popular sovereignty, and republicanism with independence, it defined the new values of a new nation. The Declaration completed that shift from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind as the central object of the American independence movement. The pursuit of happiness, it was rhetorically unique. It was a little flourish by Jefferson that became really one of the central pieces of American understandings of freedom. Although for most of Americans, winning international recognition for their independence was more important than human rights, Jefferson hoped that the Declaration would reach beyond independence and it would inspire others to claim liberty and find their own self-government. Colonists celebrated the Declaration by burning effigies of George III. They would take basically scarecrows, dress them up like the king, set them on fire, topple statues of George III. These kinds of acts help break the ties between the monarch and the people, and also to establish the legitimacy of these new state governments of the Republic. In Roman numeral number 4, let's fight the war. But in subpoint A, let's talk about the balance of power. I think few people looking at it objectively on the side say the rebels, these American patriots, they really don't stand a chance at defeating the British. Great Britain had more people and they had more money with which to go fight. The British had seasoned troops, and Americans, honestly, pretty militarily weak. Prime Minister North had assembled a large invasion force, and General William Howe was in charge of it. North ordered Howe to go capture New York City and the Hudson River, and that would isolate the radicals in New England from the other colonies and split off the angry New Englander head from the rest of the body. General William Howe marched 32,000 troops outside of New York City in July of 1776, just as the Continental Congress was declaring independence in nearby Philadelphia. Patriots, though, had some important advantages. They were fighting on their own soil, and they were inspired by their cause. And it's hard to understate how important those are. But they were honestly outgunned and outmaneuvered, and the Continental Army spent most of the early days of the war in retreat. They retreated across the Hudson River because they were pushed out. I mean, it looked like Howe was going to win this thing. They pushed the Continental Army out of New York, across the Hudson River, into New Jersey, and then across the Delaware River, fleeing into Philadelphia. The British knew that they had Washington on their heels, and then as winter was approaching, basically said American winters are much harsher than European, especially English winters. So they wanted to just hunker in. They said Washington's obviously not going to get stronger over the winter either. He has to face the same winter. So more or less the British sort of settle in for the winter. Washington's troops, they go pick up a few minor skirmishes over the winter months, but none of it seriously threatens the British military superiority. Native Americans look at this, and they really had divided loyalties during the Revolution. Though both the British and the Americans were guilty of wartime savagery towards Native Americans, different tribes ended up on different sides, and I'm not really sure there's a good side for the Americans and the British in their treatment of the Indians. Subpoint B, Howe's military strategy was to go win surrender of the opposing forces. Howe didn't want to go destroy Washington's troops. He sees them as his subjects. And this was probably the wrong move. This tactic failed in the early days, and it allowed Washington to keep the army together, even as he was losing, but it didn't stop the rebellion. Washington's strategy then was to draw the British further and further away from the sea coast. Basically, he says the British are going to get all their supplies shipped into them by sea, so let's get the army further and further away from the sea and extend their supply chain. It's kind of an old move in military practice, but it's a pretty effective one if you could do it. So he wanted to go extend the supply lines. He said that eventually the British will lose their morale. They'll look at it as a war of attrition, of just outlasting the other person. Most colonial Continental Army recruits, they came from the lower ranks of society. The majority of whom were there to go get a paycheck, actually. They fought for the promise of a bonus of cash and land rather than out of patriotism. Certainly the leadership was patriotic. Certainly the leadership was motivated by ideals, but men carrying guns, they sometimes just needed the cash more than anything. The Continental Army was poorly provisioned and poorly armed. And the war didn't go well for them for a long time. It went badly for Washington, but honestly, I think Washington's just real leadership kept the army intact. In the first year of the war, he's really pretty fortunate to escape total defeat. And I think that says a lot about Washington's leadership and cool heads when the odds are stacked against him. Washington's army crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Day in 1774, an icy river, and over the next 10 days won two crucial battles. Here I want to talk about the Battle of Trenton in December 26, 1776, where Washington defeated a garrison of Hessian mercenaries before withdrawing. Germany doesn't exist yet as we think about it, but they're German troops that are there. They're just hired by the English to go fight back, and Washington defeats these Hessian mercenaries. Then he returned to Trenton to go lure British forces further south, and then he executed a daring night march to go take Princeton on January 3rd. Those two battles suddenly make it feel like Washington's got a chance. The victories reasserted American control of much of New Jersey, and it greatly improved Patriot morale. And here I want to talk about, in subpoint C, the story of revolutionary women, which honestly don't make the headlines probably as much as they should. Many women participated in the war in a lot of various capacities. Take, for instance, one of my favorite Americans, Abigail Adams. She was John Adams' wife and truthfully his most trusted advisor. In a lot of ways, Adams didn't know who he could trust at any point, but he knew that Abigail would always shoot him straight, and she was pretty wise in her own way. She shared her political insight that very few other people, men or women, would have had. She resented the absolute power, for instance, that husbands exercised over their wives. She pleaded with him, and this Congress negotiates the future of the country. Remember the equal rights for women. Remember the ladies, she said. Now, on a less conventional note towards women's role in the Revolution, I want to introduce Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army. She served 17 months in the Army without being discovered under the name Robert Shirtliff, and she was wounded in 1782. There's a great story on this, that she escaped from the hospital because she knew that the doctor would figure out she's not a man. So she's wounded, she's been shot, she escapes from the hospital. She takes the musket ball and pries it out of her leg with her own knife, and then sews up her own wound, and then returned to the army and kept fighting. In 1783, she was honorably discharged and collected a pension. Here I want to also introduce a legal term known as coverture. Coverture was a British legal practice that said that the husbands had direct authority over their wives, and it continued even after independence. Coverture, we're talking about like the role of women in the Revolutionary era. I think it's important to understand that women didn't have a tremendous amount of legal rights. They're basically their property, either of their father or of their husband. After the Revolution, a different idea grew up, though, known as Republican motherhood. Now, Republican motherhood claimed that the main responsibilities of a married woman should be to run the household and to raise the children. Political leaders called on women to become loyal Republican mothers who would shape the character of American men. To us today, I don't think we would think of this as really like an early feminist movement, because it sounds like, yes, okay, so you raise your boys to be good boys. But I think we might put it categorically as an early movement of feminism, because it gives women a distinct role in the sphere, and one that was seen as pretty important. Republican motherhood gave responsibility in the home and in the community, and it may not be what we think of today as feminism, but it certainly was an important role that hadn't truly existed before the Revolution. At the beginning of the 19th century, so in the 1800s, beginning of the 19th century, the United States experienced a sharp decline in the birth rate, whether from the migration of men, which left women without mates for life, or delayed marriage and thus childbirth, and that limited the size of families, and again, that's going to change the role of women kind of in the new republic also. Subpoint D, let's turn our eyes back towards the war. The primary British goal was to isolate New England, of course, and it was to be achieved with the help of a new British general, new to our story anyway, known as General John Burgoyne. He also had the help of a small group of Iroquois Indians and, of course, General Howe. Howe wanted to go attack Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the home of the Continental Conquerors. It was the capital of the new United States. To go end the rebellion in just one single victory. They said, hey, let's go take the capital. We take the capital, you take the country. Let's go get that one. And so to end the rebellion in a single victory, which he took the city. Howe took the city. But the plan ultimately failed. Washington withdrew his troops from Philadelphia, and Congress fled the city. They fled into the interior. When Howe showed up to take Philadelphia, it's kind of an empty victory. He gets the city, but none of the prize that he was looking for. After a British victory at Fort Ticonderoga, Burgoyne was confident that his army would easily defeat the rebels. He says, hey, we just whooped them in Ticonderoga. Why do we have to keep pushing real hard on this? Let's let off the gas a little bit, defeat the rebels and slow his advance. That was a bad move for Burgoyne. Meanwhile, American militiamen cut British supply lines. There they surrounded Burgoyne's troops near Saratoga, New York, and after several skirmishes, Burgoyne ended up surrendering to the Patriot troops in October of 1777. The American victory at Saratoga is really the turning point in the war. Turning points are an important piece kind of in the understanding of the College Board when they write the APUSH test. They love the idea of a turning point. When it looks like things were going one way and suddenly it turns and goes in another. We would call the Battle of Saratoga a turning point in the war. It virtually ensured a military alliance with France in 1778, who was kind of holding off to say, before we go invest money and troops, we want to see if there's actually a shot at winning this thing, and the Saratoga was the proof they were looking for. With the winter of 1777 over 78, that winter, it was a pretty severe winter. The British were camped in Philadelphia. They had plenty of supplies. They were in, the most populous, urbane city in the country. While American troops, half of which were immigrants or African Americans and poor people at the bottom rungs of the ladder, they suffered at Valley Forge. Starvation and disease and malnutrition and exposure. It killed 2,500 Patriot soldiers by February of that year. Big loss of life, not by bullets, but just by cold. Subpoint E, and then it seems to get worse. Without any authority to impose taxes, remember the Continental Congress it's not like a legal body. They're not actually like operating like a government yet. Without the authority to impose taxes, Congress had to borrow gold from France. When those funds were spent, Congress had to go find new money, and they just started printing currency, currency of bills and credit. And those quickly declined in value. People said, well, this is just paper, and you're just going to print more on it, and I'm not sure this matters anything at all. So on the brink of bankruptcy, new state governments then said, okay, well, if we can't trust the Continental Congress to go print us money, we'll have the states print money, and that was also worth very little. This inflation, this just rapid printing of money, it contributed to the thought of unrest and fears that the rebellion would collapse, and even if we win this thing, if all we do is start out in a downward spiraling depression, that sucks too. In 1871, Congress established a position known as the Superintendent of Finance. Basically say, we need to figure out how to get our money straight. And so they named Robert Morris to go oversee financial matters. Robert Morris might be one of the most important founding fathers that you've never heard of, but he traded, for instance, American flour and tobacco to France in exchange for war supplies, things like guns and gunpowder and blankets. He was a wealthy international merchant. Morris kind of knew how to set up these sorts of deals, and he risked his own ships and underwrote others to go bring these supplies past the fearsome British Navy to go basically run piracy raids around the British Navy to go smuggle. The focus of the war shifted to the south in 1887 when the British intended to capture the rich tobacco and rice colonies, and also to triangulate the British as well as Americans recruited slaves to their militaries. By 1870, the British had retaken Georgia and retaken South Carolina, and it looks like the British are back on the advance again. But the tide of the battle turned when the Marquis de Lafayette convinced Louis XVI to go finally send French troops to America. American General Nathaniel Greene devised a new military strategy. Nathaniel Greene basically comes up, he says, okay, Washington's got his approach, I'm also going to give my approach on this too, which would divide local militiamen into small groups with strong leaders. There they would go harass the British. They hoped to wear down the British in a war of attrition, which honestly more or less worked as the British retreated. Then now abandoned by the British Navy and surrounded by the French Navy and Washington's colonial army, General Cornwallis of the British, he says, okay, so the Navy has been drawn off and abandoned us. The French Navy is now swarming in on us. Washington's Continental Army has surrounded us, and Cornwallis surrenders in October of 1781 at Yorktown, and diplomatically isolated in Europe, stymied militarily in America, without support at this point from the war at home. Britain just gave up the war. They said, this sucks and there's nothing left in it for us. In subpoint G, we'll settle the war with the Treaty of Paris, or the Treaty of Paris of September of 1783. There's been like 40 treaties of Paris or something like that. But the Treaty of Paris, it gave independence to the seaboard colonies. So the colonies that are, the ones that we think of as the 13 colonies, they got their independence, and it gave up any claims to British land south of the Great Lakes. Now this land, the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, was intended to be the domain, and it had been really for a long time under British control, the domain of undefeated Indians. Now, they believed that the colonists would encroach on their land, so they fought on the side of the British, but this was supposed to be Indian territory there. But the British just left the Indians to their fate. They basically said, and good luck, we're out. And the British negotiators didn't really try to insist on any separate Indian territory with border autonomy or anything. The Continental Congress and several states forced Indians to go cede most of their lands and give it over to the new United States. They viewed Britain's Indian allies as basically a conquered people. They said, well, you fought on the side of the British, and we conquered the British, and so we've conquered you, and when you get conquered, you lose your stuff. But the United States government insisted and asserted their ownership of this new trans-Appalachian West. The Native Americans said, no, it doesn't work like that. They pointed out, see, we are our own countries, we are our own nations. All these tribes are nations of, we have our own governments, we have our own land, and we didn't sign your Treaty of Paris, and so we didn't actually get conquered. The British got conquered, but you haven't conquered us. And so no, we haven't lost any war, and we don't have to give over any land. that doesn't go as smoothly for either side as they would hope. In return for all of this new American land, the British, the American government said, okay, the British merchants can recover any pre-war debt. British merchants had loaned money to Americans before the war. They still owe that money after the war. So British merchants can go recover pre-war debts. And they also encouraged state legislatures to return any confiscated property back to British loyalists. So if a person was a colonist but came out on the support of the crown, they basically said, okay, if you got your stuff seized, you can have your stuff back now that the war is over, and you can be granted citizenship. Loyalists, according to the treaty, were to not be persecuted. If a person had been loyal to the crown, but now they're willing to be a loyal American, then they can do that. When the war ended, though, as many as 60,000 loyalists left the new America to go return back to England, or go to return, maybe not even return, maybe they've been there, but to go left the colonies to go back to England, whether they were banished outright or voluntarily emigrated, because it's a new country now. It's the brand new United States of America. Welcome to our new country. You know, getting a brand new country doesn't mean that everything is right away working. It takes a little bit of practice, some trial and error. It's a complicated story. It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.